It is my privilege today to introduce our speaker, Professor Anjuli Fatima Raza Kolb. She is Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto, where she teaches post-colonial literature and theory. She is the author of the new book, Epidemic Empire, Colonialism, Contagion, and Terror, 1817 to 2020, which is just out on Chicago University Press, and which appeared very appropriately last year during the ravages of the COVID-19 global pandemic. Her other recent scholarship has appeared in a special issue of Victorian Studies on critical race theory with an article on Mary Shelley. Also an essay called Meta Dracula in Victorian Literature and Culture, and a forthcoming essay in an edited volume on the filmmaker Ritwik Ghatak. Anjuli is also a poet, translator, essayist, and a very dear friend. So please welcome her to Brown.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ben. It's an unbelievable pleasure to share space with someone I've called a colleague and a friend for so very many years. Ben and I met each other, I think, when we were both teenagers. So we have been in each other's thinking for many years. And it's a special pleasure to enter this sort of phase of our work and our careers together. And I will say, not so much in this chapter, but those of you who have studied with Ben or know him well will see his mark and his imprint in places in this book. In general, the mark and imprint of many conversations and many friends. I want to thank Ben for all of his organizational work as well tonight, and Ellen Viola for coordinating the logistics of the Zoom. And I'm excited to be with you guys here tonight, wherever you all are. I know people are a bit scattered, but I'm especially excited to hear your thoughts and questions because, as Ben mentioned, nearly everyone has come to be an expert in the cultural and material aspects of living through a pandemic this year. So I too am still learning so much about what I was studying during the years for the years during which I was making this book. In Epidemic Empire, I study the overlapping discursive, literary, political, and medical histories that have made the notion of an epidemic of terrorism a defining strain of common sense in the 21st century. I've come to think of the work that I'm doing in the book as a deep dive into a shallow metaphor with all of the potential risks that entails. This phrase and its various metaphorical elaborations have defined contemporary Islamophobia. Islam and Islamism are a, quote, cancer on the human condition, a plague on reason and progress, embedded and insidious retroviruses, ideological contagions. Although I began the book long before the COVID-19 pandemic, our moment has had no shortage of intersections with the research I did. In addition to the absolutely shocking and nightmarish spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans, much like the hate crimes against those perceived to be Muslim in the years after 9/11, the virus, as we know, was immediately associated with indiscriminate Asianness, and those who have appeared to be other in European and North American contexts have suffered grave harm as scapegoats for the kind of thinking drummed up by villainous politicians, including the former president of the US. At the start of the outbreak, for example, anticipating a dramatic wave following Eid al-Fitr, the Western media wondered whether Muslim gatherings would become super spreader events, and mosques in Salt Lake City and Missouri were vandalized and burned in apparent hate crimes. The same politicians who called for essential workers and the elderly to martyr themselves to the economy had pathologized Muslim martyrdom just years before. The conceptual and moral incoherence is staggering. Viral epidemic and pandemic figures typically work in literature, historiography, and politics to maintain a clash of civilizations thesis of the kind popularized by Samuel Huntington in his 1996 book of the same name. In my own archive, I look at how commentators on the Algerian Revolution, the Indian Mutiny of 1857, the conflict in Kashmir, the Iranian Revolution, and the current global migration crisis, for example, reach for the forceful image of Islamist and terrorist epidemics in order to shore up a notion of the healthy civilizations of the global North, while at the same time constructing the global South, post-colonial states, and the Muslim world, terms that are used, I suggest, in strategically imprecise ways, as zones of rampant infection, roiling virality, and raging epidemic poised to break out at any moment and fell the global order. Disease in this imaginary is conjured as an analog for rebellious, mutinous, insurgent, or irregular violence, categories outside of a concept of just war that create a foundation for theories and legal definitions of terrorism as a particularly virulent species of non-state or anti-state violence. In this framework, all acts of war and neo-imperial expansion and soft annexation are recoded as acts, somehow, of care. I write about how the casual language and official justifications of neo-imperialism, especially European and US American, begin in the wake of the September 11th attacks to adopt the figure of epidemic not just as a ready metaphor, but also as a disciplinary key to thinking global terror. The United States Institute for Peace, for example, suggested in a 2005 briefing that, and this is a semi-long quote, given the dynamic, unpredictable nature of Islamist militancy, we are drawn to an epidemic conception as a way of thinking and acting in response to this threat. This approach draws on the scientific principles and practices of epidemiology, as well as insights from a growing body of research on social contagion phenomena, such as fads, rumors, and civil violence. Indeed, social scientists increasingly look to epidemiology to understand a variety of contagions, and here, Islamist militancy is no different. It too can be deconstructed using the classic epidemic model. That's the end of the quote. For other policy experts and government agencies as well, including the Department of Homeland Security, epidemiology becomes a productive method in the 21st century for analyzing, combating, and securitizing a phenomenon that is understood to be virulent, shapeless, and evasive, but that nevertheless remains the object of an endless war. The possibility of a not yet existing epidemic, it should also be noted, was used by Justice John Roberts to defend the Muslim ban in 2018, calling up memories of the panicked and discriminatory response of the US Congress, not just in the deep past of the Asian exclusion laws, but also as recently as 2010, when the ban on non-US citizens who were HIV positive or suffering from AIDS was finally lifted after 22 years. My research in literature, colonial, medical, and military history, demographic and administrative reports, and official counterinsurgency documents tracks how these figures come to be so strongly associated with the non-West, with brown and Black people, with failed states, and with the so-called problem of Islam in contemporary geopolitics. I build in my book on a minor but crucial point in the great subalternist historian Ranajit Guha's essay, The Prose of Counterinsurgency, where he observes the tendency in the colonial record toward depicting peasant insurrections as natural phenomena. They break out, he observes, like thunderstorms, heave like earthquakes, spread like wildfires, and though he doesn't return to consider the figure further, they, quote, infect like epidemics. In other words, he writes, when the proverbial clod of earth turns, this is a matter to be explained in terms of natural history. A persistent feature in colonial historiography, this strategy not only dehumanizes agents of historical change, but also, as in James Mill's indelible work of Enlightenment historiography, The History of British India, excludes nonlinear models of history as irrational and, in fact, ahistorical. It is not just the naturalization or the organicization of history that is at stake in this figure. The very concept of epidemic and its methods of study are wedded to colonial history and epistemology, specifically to the history and study of cholera, the first global epidemic. In building out the mutually reinforcing histories of terrorism and epidemic, I reach back to the foundations of colonial discourse, to its administrators and recorders of history who favor a disease poetics of empire. The feted British Indian historian J.W.K., for example, who pronounced in 1850, so 7 years before the Indian Revolt, that, quote, there is nothing more contagious than rebellion. But I also look to its novelists and lyric observers. As most students of colonial literature know, Rudyard Kipling's infamous lyric, The White Man's Burden, urges the moral colonialist to take up his duties to civilize and enlighten the irrational children of the hotter climates, but also to fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. Tasks, he asserts, that come with neither glory nor reward. My work in this book interrogates how this admonishment to care in the context of comparative imperialisms is neither an accident nor a rhetorical infelicity. It establishes and constantly reinforces a sense of the colonized and the underdeveloped world as both sick and the source of sickness. Empire's disease poetics, and I mean this both in the self-evident way, the metaphorics of disease in empire, but also as a poiesis or a making, the way empire creates itself and defines its borders through the management of disease, shapes colonial history and historiography, and solidifies the intractable association between race, violence, and epidemic. In so doing, the epidemic thesis produces an inhuman, natural enemy in order to obscure and invalidate political demands and to justify a global security apparatus in defense of humanity, a category that is constituted by its exclusion of phenomena perceived as contagious, like terror, like Islam, like non-white people. As we have learned or relearned over the last months, even epidemics are not natural in the sense that their courses are shaped profoundly by human interaction and human behavior. The COVID-19 pandemic has been exactly as cruel as we have allowed it to be. What I offer in this book is the background that helps explain the horrific injustices of our present moment, racial, imperial, capitalist, and yes, scientific. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the book, and then I'll move to an excerpt from the 5th chapter. In the first 3 chapters of Epidemic Empire, I show how these figures of disease have become easy analogies for terrorism and Islam for very pointed reasons to do with how the British imagined and wrote the 2 greatest threats to its empire in the 19th century, the Asiatic cholera outbreaks and the Indian Mutiny of 1857. The chiastic historical and literary record consolidates each of these events in the image of the other, such that the mutiny becomes legible as a contagion originating with the Muslim troops in the native army, while the cholera outbreaks are imagined as the very land's rebellion, a vengeful and murderous assault on Hastings' army, the apparatus of trade, and by extension, the entire liberal economy and colonial system. The Asiatic cholera epidemics, understood to travel west by way of the vast numbers of Indian pilgrims performing Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca over land and by sea, corollarily imagine South Asian Muslims as mobile vectors not just of pestilence, but also of political disaffection, anti-colonial sentiment, and new and powerful nationalisms. In the first chapter, I read Kipling's novel Kim as a blueprint for the assassination of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in 2011. In chapter 2, I read an archive of 19th century cholera writing and early epidemiological texts. And in chapter 3, Bram Stoker's novel of the shifting borders of the Orient, Dracula. So the first 3 chapters deal with the 19th century record of disease and rebellion in the British Empire, largely in India, but also extended to the more proximate colonial zones of Ireland, poor and working class England, which were disproportionately affected by the cholera epidemics and later the famine. In the second part of the book, I show how these associations are taken up and reassorted during the Algerian independence movement in the 1950s, drawing on both British and French colonial discourses of medicine, political theory, and the ongoing construction of Islam and Muslim peoples as a global plague. My key texts here are Camus' journalistic writings on Algeria and his epidemic novel, La Peste, the torture memoir of Algerian freedom fighter Jamil Abu Pasha, and I'll mostly talk about that section today. Gio Pontecorvo's film, The Battle of Algiers, famously screened at the Pentagon at the start of the War on Terror, and the Algerian medical writings of Frantz Fanon. In the book's final part, I read the language of late 20th and early 21st century Islamophobia across a suite of works by Salman Rushdie, as well as the 9/11 Commission report, the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture, and Solma Sharif's poems in her stunning debut documentary collection, Look, where the speaker or speakers incorporate, inhabit, and transform military terminology from the Department of Defense dictionary. In addition to the dehumanizing effects of imperial disease poetics, the practices of quarantine, the policing of sanitary borders, national and international vaccination programs, conflicting immunities, and a terror of global pandemic have tended to serve protectionist and West-centric interests. They have also, as we have seen over the last months, utterly failed to cognize the actual threat of pandemics, as if the West and the global North were in some kind of alternate timeline from the rest of the world. The events in the US Capitol on January 6, 2021 have brought me back to some of my earliest questions about epidemics and insurgency. Today, we are not talking about a figural overlap. As in the late 1850s in India, we are talking about an actual and acute intertwining of pandemic and insurrection, one anti-colonial and one white supremacist. It's worth thinking more about what the shared condition of vulnerability brought on by a pandemic enables in terms of collective thinking, and what it enables in terms of reconceptualizing who counts as the body politic. Racist white Americans have reacted violently to understanding themselves as existing in the same space, pandemic space, if you will, as the rest of us. It is inconceivable to them. Anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, pandemic deniers are saying many things, but one of the things they are saying is, I refuse the pan or universality of this condition. It doesn't apply to me. My body, white America's body, is not vulnerable. It is immured, immune. It doesn't need to hide behind a mask. To some extent, they are right. The medical racism in this country, to give a very complex set of factors a short name, has made Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people leagues more vulnerable to COVID-19. The breach of the Capitol, then, was a ritualized performance of the immunity to police and the sovereignty, feet on Pelosi's desk, the seizing of the rostrum of the white, able, cis, hetero body. What I'm trying to say is that the questions of the book, I think, are very much with us today. For the remainder of my time with you, I'm going to narrow in on the Algerian texts and contexts that I read in chapter 5. In a way, this section is a departure from the major arguments of the book. I move away here from a set of observations and evidence that crystallize the relationship between epidemic, race, religion, religion as ethnicity, religion as race, and anti-colonial violence, and into an examination of what an anti-imperial deployment of science might look like. I follow Frantz Fanon primarily in this chapter in pursuing a clearer sense of what can be done by actors who seek to subvert the dominant paradigm of colonial medicine or to appropriate its lessons to revolutionary and affiliative ends. Before I move into these excerpts from the book, I will say that the material that I work with here is difficult testimony. It involves sexual violence as narrated by the woman against whom it was perpetrated, and also the violence of state language as it seeks to grapple with and paraphrase this testimony and the evidence. These ideas are at play in much of what I will share, but I will also mark again when I get closer to the language in case anybody feels that it's best to dip out or silence the video for a few moments. If you do decide that you'd like to silence the video for a few moments, I'm going to show a plain light blue slide when that section of the talk is finished, so you'll have a visual cue of when it might be okay to come back in. And I will show some images as well, though none of them are explicitly graphic or violent in nature. Because we're all in a life of extreme Zoom fatigue, I guess I should also say, like, I'm gonna read to you from the physical object that is my book. So I will be kind of slightly disengaged from the screen for a little while. And this might, if you need to stretch your body or get up and move, this might be a good time to do that. And I'll kind of signal when we're getting into the part where I'd love to see you so that we can talk and do questions. So I will start sharing my screen now. I have a couple of slides that I'll show you as we go through, and then give you a bit of a warning when we get closer to the difficult portions. So for anybody who'd like to take a look at this, this is all material from chapter 5 of the book and a few pages, 176 to 177, and then I'll give you page numbers further on. So I've just discussed in this chapter the screening of the Battle of Algiers at the Pentagon. The Pentagon's decision to screen the Battle of Algiers made material a history that was already pressing at the conceptual and ethical edges of the war on terror. The understanding of this history of Algerian terrorism, visually consonant with a Western image of the Muslim world as a veiled, chaotic space, shuttled in the American public imaginary between, on the one hand, righteous violence against colonial occupation and a faith in the community shaped by an underground resistance, and on the other, the cultural and psychological black box of Muslims committing acts of terrorism, made more incomprehensible in our own moment by the movement towards suicidal martyrdom. Algeria became the 20th century linchpin for a 21st century understanding of terror from a Muslim place, the kernel that would evolve, unlike models from the IRA or early 20th century anarchisms, into a conceptual and hermeneutic model for Islamist terrorism in the years that followed. The 2006 republication of Alistair Horn's classic 1977 history of the Algerian liberation struggle, A Savage War of Peace, and that line, that title of that book is also taken from Kipling's The White Man's Burden. So New York Review of Books republished that book in 2006. So the republication by the New York Review of Books, a boutique press with a left sympathetic audience, confirmed the centrality of the Algerian precedent across the political spectrum and in multidisciplinary terms. The cover of the new edition bears a blurb backgrounded in splashy orange. Anyone interested in Iraq should read this book immediately. Just to give you a sense of what the visual relationship is that I'm discussing in the sections that precede the section I'll share with you, I do a little bit of work on the visual citations so this is a still from the Battle of Algiers, this is a mapping of the terror cells, and this is a still from Steven Soderbergh's film that was released on November 9th, 2009, I believe. Is that right? 2011, Contagion. And Soderbergh in an interview says, Battle of Algiers is a film from which I stole stuff. I copied stuff and made it mine. Here you see a portrait of Jamila Boupasha, the woman whose testimony I'm going to be describing. And I will, again, when I get to the violent language, give you another warning. But it's, I think, interesting to note that this, this sketch that was made by Pablo Picasso in 1961 was part of the broader kind of press push to make some changes in hexagonal France on the basis of a shift in left opinion. And you'll hear a little bit about that in the pages that I read. The medical space. So anybody who wants to look this up, I'm starting now on page 193. The medical space is always a fraught one for the colonial subject and for the colonized woman in particular, irrespective of social class and education, though these factors can certainly compound inaccessibility to avenues of power and legitimacy in the colonial state. The FLN, that is the Algerian Revolutionary Army's reversal of imperial disease poetics, as it is depicted in Pontecorvo's film, and the adoption of the plague metaphor by pro-liberation French intellectuals were not without consequences. Particularly as the revelations of torture methods used in Algeria began leaking more widely in France, the status of medical evidence would play an increasingly large and often doubly victimizing role in the transformation of public opinion, and later the transformation of French policy with respect to its oldest and most precious colonial holding, that is Algeria. The text most responsible for putting not just testimony, but specifically the medical testimony and its dossier of scientific proofs and repeated gynecological examinations firmly at the center of the debate in France over the horrors being visited, in Henri Alleg's memorable words, in their name in Algeria, was the story of Jamila Boupasha, whose portrait you see here. The book was written by her lawyer, Gisèle Halimi, and sold prominently under the name of Simone de Beauvoir, whose introduction to the volume revisited the devastating and politically transformative essay she wrote for Le Monde for Jamila Boupasha in June of 1960. The Paris massacre, in which Parisian police opened fire on a massive pro-FLN demonstration in the metropole, it should be noted, had occurred in the months between Jamila's imprisonment and de Beauvoir's essay. Before turning to Boupasha's memoir and the pivot of the vaginal examination therein, it's instructive to return briefly to another less often cited text in Frantz Fanon's A Dying Colonialism, or The Fifth Year of the Algerian Revolution, which is the French title, which calls back in striking ways to the ungowning of the Algerian woman in the colonial doctor's office in Algeria Unveiled. In the essay called Medicine and Colonialism, Fanon describes the experience of the colonized person as the object of Western medical scrutiny. This encounter, he argues, must be historicized, situated, disburdened of the natural assumption that all scientific progress is good, that to its unassailable goals of providing succor or easing pain, no negative reaction can be justified. He begins the essay with what he calls the Algerian Example, and this is a quote. Introduced into Algeria at the same time as racialism and humiliation, Western medical science, being part of the oppressive system, has always provoked in the native an ambivalent attitude. This ambivalence is in fact to be found in connection with all of the occupiers' modes of presence. With medicine, we come to one of the most tragic features of the colonial situation. For Fanon, the reality of colonial medicine presents itself as, quote, one of the most tragic features of the colonial situation, precisely because of the promise of care that is as constantly withdrawn as it is grudgingly given. The betrayals of the Hippocratic Oath of which he speaks do not manifest solely in the dehumanizing conduct of the European doctor toward his Algerian patients, though this is certainly an important facet of his grim analysis. Fanon is also at pains to note the particularly two-faced role played by doctors in the war through the withholding of care, medications, and confidentiality, in addition to the administration of torture, truth serums, and their covering up. Of particular interest to Fanon is how the colonial encounter invariably creates the Algerian as an insubordinate or non-compliant patient. In his terror at entering the hospital of the whites, of the strangers, of the conqueror, the Algerian is already locked in a battle with the presumed forces of care and their empirical foundations he will find there, already resistant to its prescription and invasions of his body, and the broader social fabric that has maintained it in health and now betrays it in sickness. The recalcitrant patient as non-compliant subject emerges in Fanon's essay in parallel to the veiled Algerian woman, inaccessible, ambivalent, a little masochistic, in the collection's first chapter. This is from Algeria Unveiled. The colonized Algerian proves to be an equally unsatisfying patient. The patient plays hide and seek with his doctor. The doctor has no hold on the patient. He finds that in spite of promises and pledges, an attitude of flight, of disengagement persists. All the efforts exerted by the doctor, by his team of nurses to modify this state of things encounter not a systematic opposition, but a vanishing on the part of the patient, end quote. Life in this scheme of fugitivity, self-vanishing and disengagement resembles for Fanon an incomplete death. Unsurprisingly, neither the European doctor nor the colonial system in which he is employed recognizes the patient's rejection of medical treatment as a systematic strategy, part of an organized revolt against the epistemic and disciplinary reach of systematic violence. Fanon posits this rejection not as a refusal of life, but a greater passivity before that close and contagious death. In the face of such refusals, such monosyllables, the patient's unwillingness to talk, to indicate where it hurts, to describe his life or reveal his past, the European doctor harbors hope in the clinical examination, thinking, writes Fanon, quote, that the body would be more eloquent. In Fanon's story, the paradigmatic Algerian patient yields himself neither verbally nor corporeally. To the doctor's dismay, the body proved equally rigid. The muscles were contracted. There was no relaxing. A more precise translation of Fanon's last phrase directs us to the war unfolding in the clinic. Il n'y a pas de détente. There was no détente. This is the moment that I'm going to mark as moving into some very explicit graphic testimonial from Jamila Boupasha. And as I mentioned before, if this is something that you don't want to hear, I will show, I just want to make sure it's here. I'll show that light blue slide when I get to the end of it so you can pop back in. It was to her credit and great good fortune that the 23-year-old Algerian woman, Jamila Boupasha, arrested on February 10th, 1960 on suspicion of planting a bomb in a university cafe in Algiers and harboring FLN members, recognized the demands of colonial medicine as an extension of the demands of an imperial legal system. From the first day following her horrific experiences of torture, La Question in LBR prison outside of Algiers, where interrogators stripped her, spat gouts of beer onto her body, scotch-taped electrical wires to her nipples, stubbed out cigarettes on her thighs, raped her with a toothbrush and an empty beer bottle, kicked her in the ribs and the back, and left her passed out in a pool of her own blood, Boupasha would insist again and again on a medical examination. When they pressed her to identify a handbag found at the site of the bombing as her own, she refused. They told her she would be taken back for another dose of medicine. Her bloodstained shift, the bruises on her back and torso, her broken and displaced ribs she knew would not be enough. Her vaginal hemorrhaging would not be enough. Although she confessed to an outlandish number of crimes and terrorist attacks under interrogation, she retained enough confidence, whether cynical or idealistic, in both the legal and medical institutions in French Algeria to request repeatedly to be seen by a doctor, a woman doctor if possible. As a student in her early 20s, Boupasha's faith in the medical system and its ability to fulfill its responsibilities to the people of Algeria was beginning to waver. Prior to her arrest, Boupasha had been working as a probationer in the Beni Missous hospital and revealed in her first conversation with her lawyer, the Tunisian-born Gisèle Halimi, that she had stolen medical supplies for the FLN the day after she learned that Muslim girls working in the hospital would not be allowed to take their certificates. The first physician who examined Bupasha after her ordeal, Dr. Lévy-Leroy, noted the evidence of brutal beatings, the rib contusions, and burns and bruises, but admitted to the involvement of her sex only insofar as he observed, quote, constitutional menstrual irregularities. In other words, irregular vaginal bleeding. Though he initially admitted that he hadn't properly examined the prisoner who had not removed her clothes, he would later revise his statement to insist that he had inspected her, quote, completely naked, and could not speak to any evidence of vaginal trauma following her torture, since the girl had not specifically complained of being assaulted sexually, and that, in any case, evidence of, quote, traumatic defloration, the phrase would later be used to describe her rape, was rather illegible on the self-healing elastic surface of the young woman's vaginal walls. In Bupasha's words, quote, every time I tried to tell him what had been done to me, he said, oh, there's no harm in that, no harm at all. He scarcely examined me at all. The whole thing was over in about 2 minutes. He felt my ribs and looked at my fingers, saying, nothing serious here, nothing to worry about. I didn't even undress. Two things changed the course of Bupasha's trial and caused it to transcend the thousands of others awaiting some form or at least performance of justice in Algeria. These were the transfer of the proceedings to France, tirelessly fought for by Halimi, whose travel to and from Algeria was, like many Parisian lawyers, or FLN lawyers as they were known, restricted and strategically blocked by Algerian authorities. And second, the resonance of her girlhood and the loss of her virginity for the makers of left public opinion in France, who eventually triumphed in getting Bupasha a new medical examination in late July 1960, 5 months after her torture. Though they could not attribute her many scars to electrical or cigarette burns without a skin biopsy, which they refused to do, a committee of 5 doctors, including a woman, Hélène Michel Wolfram, would report, granted that after 5 months, the rapid healing of vulvovaginal tissue normally makes it impossible to identify the method employed in any particular instance of defloration, and further, bearing in mind the fact that we could consult no other examination of the subject's genital organs made prior to her arrest, our answer to the second question remains, nevertheless, yes, Jamila Bupasha may well have had the neck of a bottle inserted into her vaginal passage. At the date of examination, 28th July 1960, it is impossible to specify either the date or the exact method of her defloration with any precision, but the tightness of the vaginal passage, the thickness of the hymen, and the narrow localization of the actual perforations, analogous to those observable in the case of surgical defloration, which involves a single dilation of the speculum, all might well argue in favor of a traumatic defloration. That's the end of the quote from the medical examiners. Dr. Michel Wolfram followed the physical examination with a psychiatric assessment and observed that Bupasha seemed constitutionally incapable of dishonesty, as well as noting that she had clearly suffered a mental trauma in the course of her rape, to which she returned during their conversation in a, quote, obsessional manner. Michel Wolfram, who spoke repeatedly of her disinterest in the politics of the case, attributed Bupasha's obsession with virginity to the fanatical hyperinvestment of purity in Islamic culture. Although Halimi concedes the legal necessity of Bupasha's re-examination in France, titling the book's dramatic culminating chapter, Fresh Medical Examination, she is also pained by what she understands as her infliction on Jamila of successive interviews and inspections. They involved, she reflects, a double humiliation, being obliged to undress and having her word doubted. We are returned here to a formulation that first appeared in a text Halimi undoubtedly read, Fanon's lucid commentary on the ripping of the Algerian woman's veil in the colonist rape dream as a double deflowering. This violence and its potential for an eroticized sensationalism akin to the harem fantasies of an earlier Orientalism would become an important tool in the dissemination of Bupasha's story to the broader public. Building this part of the case would require an emphasis on Jamila's girlhood, her beauty, her innocence, not just in legal terms, but also spiritual ones. I'm just going to note that this is the end of the graphic depictions of torture. On Bupasha's arrival in Paris, for example, Halimi notes how she was transported immediately in an ambulance to Fresnes, where she would await her trial. Reunited with her client on more promising soil, she recalls Bupasha's breathless, girlish excitement at having flown in an airplane for the first time at being in France. Bupasha says, I keep peering out the window of the plane, you know, she told me. It was my first trip by air. An airplane is a wonderful thing. I saw the top of the Eiffel Tower too, but they used a closed van to bring me here from the airport and I couldn't see a thing. Do you think I'll be able to go for a walk with you in Paris? Do you? just the last couple of paragraphs. In these moments, Jamila Bupasha is pictured both truthfully and deliberately, strategically as a young girl. Do you? As a wide-eyed and untroubled as Picasso's sketch portrait completed in 1961 that graces the book's cover. The rhetorical process of her humanization from militant terrorist to jeune fille was a crucial and calculated element of the book's impact. Even as they disavowed the moral laziness of simply feeling bad or finding mere sympathy with the beautiful Algerian without recognizing the complicity of metropolitan readers in the system that tortured and raped her, the salaries they paid to her torturers, the book's authors could not reasonably squander the resource of her beauty, her charisma, her compelling presence, and the marks of her trauma that heightened these qualities. That Jamila, as well as her sister Nafisa, also imprisoned for collaborating with the FLN, and her mother were already unveiled Algerian women before the accusations and trial came to light, both made this aesthetic case easier and also necessitated the deeper violation of putting the text of her sex before the world in all its legibility. For a girl already unveiled, another kind of forcible denuding would have to substitute. The public shock caused in France, the vast wave of sympathy her story elicited, the signing of letters on her behalf by what now looks like a roster in an introduction to critical theory, not just Sartre and Beauvoir, but also Jean Amrouche, Germaine Tillon, Michel Leiris, André Schwartz-Bart, Aimé Césaire, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jacques Lacan, and Edouard Glissant, among many, many others, also reached American shores where the translation into English by Peter Green was published the same year. In recognizing the requirements of a system of colonial medicine as the colonial state for compliance, submission, access, and cooperation as a strategy she might deploy in her own interests and those of her countrymen, Bupasha took the insights of the FLN's inversion of her epidemic metaphoricity to its limit, offering her own body as its sacrificial collateral in ways that exceed the ordinary expectations that the militant put her body on the line. In this way, she replicates the strategy Beauvoir notes as the cruelly necessary mode in which Halimi set herself to work in the scandalously unjust French legal system. Jamila Bupasha's story, anchored in her rape at the hands of French paratroopers, renders visible the logic of infinite penetration and serial violation that holds the colonial fantasy of caregiving and domination as two sides of the same coin. This story, it seems, is impossible to tell, impossible even to envision in the case of Muslim women in their shrouds without the demand that even their inner tissues be held apart by the speculum, under the fluorescent lights, and the scientific gaze of the exam room, shabbily redecorated from its former use as a torture chamber. We are not yet free of this double bind. And before we turn things to questions, I just thought I'd show very quickly, there's a whole proliferation of art that was made about Jamila Bupasha and her case. This is a series of sketches made by Robert Lapoujade. This is a group painting that was involved in a kind of a huge tableau made by the Anti-Fascist Collective in 1960. It was understood to be pornographic. Jamila is depicted almost drawn and quartered. I'll show you a close-up, but up here in the top left corner of the painting, and you see her body displayed in this way, instrumentalized in this way in this painting as well. The final section of the chapter goes on to discuss the uses of girlhood in Steve McCurry's very famous Afghan girl photograph, and then the revisiting under the auspices of a National Geographic report in, I believe, 2012, when McCurry went back and found Sherbat Gula, who is the woman who is depicted in this photograph. So for anyone who's interested in looking more at that and the uses of girlhood now in the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, that's how the chapter ends. So I've gone on for quite a long time. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm so excited to hear your questions and thoughts.
All right. Thank you, Anjuli. So I will call on people for questions so that we don't have a mad rush. If you could make your presence known, raise your hand. I think it's under reactions, or it might be in the participants section of the Zoom interface. Raise your hand and I will call on you in that order. Yeah, Christina, please.
Hi, thank you. That was so wonderful. I was wondering, I have kind of a more general question about your project, which is I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you chose the events that you chose, since you have such a kind of broad time period that you're covering, sort of how you zeroed in on sort of the main focuses of each chapter and kind of the way you see them linked.
Thank you for that question. There are many ways to answer it. I think I'll start by saying that I was kind of committed. This is a sort of odd example, the one that I've given you today, but I was committed to what Jed Esty calls famous books. And I was committed to famous books because they have a really clear porosity between the literary and a kind of public culture. I wanted to make sure that the claims I was making could hold some weight. I'm not trying to make them hold causal weight. I don't think that Dracula, set out like late colonial policy or the establishment of the League of Nations, but the ongoing influence of that novel and the mythologies that are associated with it mean that a story like that smuggles a lot into every present at which it becomes famous again. So there was obviously, as you know, huge millennial vampire surge after 9/11. So my questions mostly emerged out of a sense of like exploration of genealogies of the present. And because just to give the briefest answer possible, because there was this cultural phenomenon that drew on longer histories of Islamophobic Gothics, it became a little bit easier for me to map out what were the moments that were actually just coming back in force in those years after 9/11, culturally, politically, and in the space that sort of merges and flows in between. So many rules had to be put in place for me to narrow down the focus of this book, which is already, my editor joked with me, like, do you want to just have the end of the date range be like infinity, like 1817 to forever? And at some point, like a book has to just be finished. So I guess the other thing I would say is that there are many, many stories of pathogenicity, of the othering of pathogenic populations that are fascinating and tell different stories. They're not as thickly braided into the present of Islamophobia. And it was useful to me in circumscribing a project that I could actually finish to say, this is the angle that I'm going for. Like, I want this specific nexus, because to write about plagues in literature is an endless kind of project. So I read all of that stuff, and then I had to throw out thousands of pages of notes and writing. Ben remembers, poor thing. We talked about Thomas Mann quite a lot for a couple of years there. Does that get at your question, Christina?
Yeah, that was exactly. That was great. Thank you. That was really helpful.
I also like to be as practical as possible in these talks. And I will just say, like, no one ever told me until I sent my manuscript to my editor, like, how many words can you get away with in a book? And it turns out, like, not 250,000. So don't do that.
Actually, I will use abuse my powers to call on myself. I have basically three points. One, I've heard this before, but this is a fantastic talk, especially what I've not heard before, which is your reading of the January 6th. We don't even know what to call it. The white supremacist storming of the Capitol, I suppose. I just thought that was the best account I've heard of that event. So, you should not waste it on us. That is just so utterly convincing, I think. The second thing, this is a specific question about some material in your talk, which is about the Battle of Algiers. I know you skimmed over and showed the whiteboard in Contagion with the chalkboard in the Battle of Algiers. I wonder, since you've thought about that movie more, though, it's an interesting story, the way that it's set up narratively, because of course you're rooting for the rebels. But the plot of the film, until it skips forward in the, practically the closing credits, to this spontaneous outpouring, is the slow eradication of the FLN, right? So it's as if what I was thinking for the first time as you were talking is it's as if the film is really from the point of view of the virus being vaccinated, and that's running, its tide is running backwards. Whereas, of course, I assume a movie like Contagion is from the point of view of the heroes.
Yeah, the disease hunters. We love that from the Victorian period. Mm-hmm.
And so this is a strange, the Battle of Algiers is a strange film in that sense, because you're rooting for the disease as it gets squashed, essentially. And so that's, maybe you have some more to say about that. And then a third thing that is quite just, maybe unanswerable and vague is just about the role of narrative medicine as a possible thing that you hate or you're interested in, because I've been reading and teaching Wings of the Dove, and the Columbia Narrative Medicine Program, the director of the Columbia Narrative Medicine Program says this was the book that got me interested in narrative as an ethics of care and alterity, which is weird because there is, not to go off about Wings of the Dove, but there is some doctoring in Wings of the Dove. And it's nothing. Like the doctor looks at the dying girl and he's like, mm-hmm. And that's it, which could not be a model to recommend. But, plainly it's not that aspect of the novel. But I just wonder, in the discussion of colonial care, it seems that, the universal basis of quote unquote narrative medicine is being jostled somewhat.
Yeah.
You could think about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a series of really expert questions, and I have to say I don't know that I have a firm answer about the last of them yet. So let me talk about the Battle of Algiers for a second, and then I'll come to it. I mean, I don't know if I've told you this, but I'm also teaching a mini course in the Narrative Medicine Master's program starting on Friday, so I'll have more to tell you. Okay, sidebar. We'll talk about narrative medicine in a second, but I think that you've got, in the end of the Battle of Algiers, I guess I wouldn't say that we're not seeing the events exactly from the pathogen's perspective, but there is something really interesting that happens at the end of that film, so for those of you who haven't seen it, first of all, get off this Zoom immediately and hang up now and go watch it, and then come back and I'll tell you. But so there's the cell that's being tracked most closely in the film, the kind of group protagonist, is eradicated about 3/4 of the way through. And then more than that, 9/10 of the way through. And then there's it's a kind of fake newsreel. And then it's okay, however many years later, 3-4 years later, the way that the French commentators in the film describe it is a spontaneous and almost overnight. Flags have come out. In fact, they're not even flags. We should just probably call them bed sheets. And then there's an announcement that comes over a loudspeaker, and the announcement is asking the people who are pouring into the streets in Algiers. The revolution has really moved to the mountains for a couple of years, and then it's bursting back forth in the city after this real militarized crackdown in the city. And the loudspeaker is saying, what do you want? Go back to your houses. What do you want? And the people are literally carrying flags, right? So there's this deliberate obscuring of a message, the semiotics of public protest that couldn't be clearer. They're we want a country, Tahia al-Jazair, right? So they're saying, and the French commentators are falling into this, what I would call the Guha-esque trap of the naturalization of revolution. So they can't even imagine that all they have understood is this pathogen. And they're oh, we thought we got it. It doesn't want anything. It's just spreading, right? But in fact, there is a politics. And so the pathogenic metaphor really breaks down at the end of that film. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you guys today, but it turns out it's so long to read pages of a book. is the section where I talk about so this emergence of the nation, let's just call it, the emergence of the nation at the end of that film happens through a kind of layer of smoke. So it's another unveiling. There's an unveiling of these like drapeaux, these flags that come out and are unfurled from windows and so forth. But there's also a clearing of fog, which is both an apocalyptic gesture, like apocalypse in its literal sense as apocalypsos or unveiling, but also like the nation is submitting to this this opening, this uncovering, right? In a gesture that I see as being strategically parallel to what Bupasha does in submitting to this medical examination. So that in the face of language of obscurantism, of confusion, why are they doing this? I mean, we can hear this in the post 9/11 era, like, why do they hate us? What do they want, right? That's what I call oftentimes in the book, the black box of Muslim subjectivity. Like, we told you. So I think that there's a kind of, there's a breakdown or a reversal of the pathogenic metaphor in the film there. And, you know, it's, once you're looking for it, it's absolutely obvious, not just the kind of metaphorics, the word fléau, which comes from Camus' La Peste, is like all over the place in the movie, and these kind of contagious metaphors are all over the place in the movie. But there's also a real like material plot. And Jennifer Johnson has a great book about this, The Red Crescent in Algeria, is I think maybe the subtitle. She's a historian who worked on health interventions that kind of came up around the FLN and then were nationalized after Algerian independence in 1962. But there's also like totally like paramilitary strategy involved in who has access to medical care. So for example, anybody in the period of the Battle of Algiers, anybody who came into a hospital for a gunshot wound was ratted out by French doctors. So you couldn't get bandages, you couldn't get painkillers, and you without being turned in as a member of the FLN. So even just that sense of access, right, to the care that is being imposed or promised or something, right, bid the sickness cease, and then like, well, but if you got shot by us, you know, you're going to jail and we're going to torture you. So let me not go on about that forever. I want to come to the question of narrative medicine. I think it's tough. I really, I mean, especially over the last year, I really do think that there's a lot. God, I mean, I sound very like, bless your heart. There's a lot in the kind of ethical center of what narrative medicine can do at its best. It has not achieved much in terms of literary interpretation. I think where it's working is in the training of doctors and policymakers, especially doctors who are headed towards management. That's a horrible word, but like doctors who are headed toward education, toward setting the tone of a practice. Honestly, like in early law and literature, there was a lot of, like, as you say about Wings of the Dove, I don't know if you remember that hellish class that I taught with Robert Ferguson about law and literature. And it was just like, there's a lawyer in this book. There's a lawyer in this book. There's a lawyer in this book. Here's another lawyer. Like, here's a scene in a courtroom. There was no theorizing of what that meant. There was also no understanding that the law could itself, right? Like legal text could itself be read the way that literature is read. So Fanon is like, it's so important for how I think about, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but like, let's just be clear, at the foundation of the most important thinkers of post-colonial thought is narrative medicine. Like, that's weird, right? We don't think about it this way. We don't think of Fanon's practice as a psychoanalyst as being foundational to what we understand to be post-colonial literary criticism, but it absolutely is. And students have, I don't know if anybody here has read Black Skin, White Mask. Students have so much of a hard time with that book, I think partly because, well, first of all, because it's a thesis, so it's like a mess. And secondly, because he's treating novels and anecdotes and his own experience and medical case studies like they're all the same thing, right? I mean, it's just beautiful Foucauldian discourse analysis when you think about it, but it's bananas. And I think unless you have spent a lot of time reading legal and medical documents with a kind of disposition that we can approach them all with similar tools, whatever those tools are. I mean, I use my tools, right? Other people use their tools, but they're subject to formal analysis. They're subject to poetic analysis. They're subject to, honestly, all kinds of close reading even. And so I think that there is hope there. And I think as we all are, like the course I'm teaching is in public writing and public health. Like we need it. There's a huge gap in what we are doing right now in terms of thinking between the skill set of literary critics and the skill set of doctors. Also, it was just, I was thinking this morning, like, there aren't a lot of other professions in our culture that seem to have such a bright line between those who are expert and those who are not. But, any of us who has ever been a patient knows that, like, there are times when you know better what's going on in your body than the person who's talking to you for 2 minutes. That stuff, patient advocacy, I've been talking about this a little bit more lately, and I want to say it here too. Like, patient advocacy is something that we can all get involved in right now, because not everything that needs to happen can happen in those, those very brief appointments that are possible to access. Okay, I will stop going on. I see Gautam has a question.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the talk, and I'm very excited to read the book. And I had a question about the mutiny chapter, or the chapter on 19th century India, and the sort of Guha-esque phenomenon that you're talking about, the sort of insurgency as religious consciousness, and the naturalization of that in the context of his sort of reading of the Santal uprising.
Yeah.
And I wanted to sort of ask if the material, or in your sort of the material that you're reading, you sort of encountered that other form of religious consciousness, sort of hesitate to call pollution or purity and pollution, the sort of mobilization of hygiene discourse to solidify a caste hierarchy within the sort of Hindu society or populations. And I'm wondering if there's a connection to be drawn between pollution and contagion in the sense of establishing that kind of purity against the contagion of rebellion. And I'm also thinking about how what sets off the rebellion is the polluting nature of the sort of pork and beef materials that the soldiers had to use. So I'm just sort of, I just wanted to throw that word pollution out there and see if that had any sort of resonances with this, with the idea of contagion here.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising this. It's something that comes up specifically to an extent in the mutiny chapter, of course, not just because of the mythology and and then the materiality of the Lee Enfield rifle, which was, for those of you who might not know, rumored to be greased with pork fat and cow fat, so polluting to both Muslims and Hindus in the soldiery, but also because that myth came back in Trump's campaign speeches prior to 2016. So it was a moment of, I actually remember very specifically talking with Ben about this, about those sentences in my introduction, because I thought it was just really difficult to work out, like, what is the repulsion that's borrowed from 19th century caste preservation that Trump, buddies with Modi, is now mobilizing in this moment of American fascism. So I do write a little bit about this. I also write about it a little bit in the figure of Osman in the Satanic Verses. So the 6th chapter of the book is a reading of 3 Rushdie books, 2 novels, Shalimar the Clown and the Satanic Verses, and then his memoir, Joseph Anton. And like, not disingenuously, I straight up love the Satanic Verses and I think it's amazing. The other 2 books that I read in that chapter are occasion for me to really make an enemy of Sir Salman. So let's see, hope he doesn't read it. Osman is a character who becomes a kind of archetype for what you're talking about. And he becomes an archetype in the sense that he is a convert to Islam, literally to gain access to a well. So there are kind of choleric resonances there, like what is access to water, who is allowed, what are the perceptions of pollution. But the creation of a Muslim community in the Satanic Verses is, in some senses, and not in all, but in some senses, this really generous and capacious idea about a religion that will catch anyone, or a group identity that will catch anyone who has been outcast, literally, or punished for being untouchable. There was a moment at which there was a section in that chapter about Mulkraj Anand's novel Untouchable, which was kind of classic of modern, like kind of on the hinge, modernist, Victorianist, again about water and caste, and the relationship between pollution and modernity. But it wound up being excised in the end, so it's not there. I think it might actually come up in the next book as well. I don't have something coherent to say about this figure, though, because it doesn't work in a coherent or consistent fashion. It's present all over the place, but it's very mobile. And the concept of pollution is oftentimes gendered, casted, raced in ways that shift pretty dramatically from political agenda to time period to geography. So it's an amazing question. It's just not one that I have a very precise answer to.
All right, Susie, will you ask your question, please?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the talk. That was really illuminating. I think I lowered my hand. Yes, I did. So my question is more of just like a general, I just want you to elaborate more kind of a question. So how do you locate pain in the exclusionary body politic and the metaphor of disease that is so easily appropriated by imperialism, as you framed it? I ask because pain is specifically that gray area that hygiene discourse and quarantine procedures deal with in such conflating ways, depending on which body that they're looking at. So like pain can be weaponized, not as a symptom of disease to mark you out, but also it's considered sometimes a necessary course to cure or like sanitize you. And it's also crucial to the narrative of the oppressed, especially in inciting sympathy and more political action en masse. So put shortly, I guess I just want to hear you speak more about pain in the rhetoric of disease and body politic.
Fabulous question. I'm not going to answer this at length because it's in fact, I mean, it's not something that I thought a lot about, which makes me like really excited to hear you ask this because it's sending my mind in a million different directions. I mean, here's where it comes up in the archive and in the book. It's mostly as an opportunity for affiliation. So psychic pain especially, and I don't mean that in some kind of like, you know, take a bath, self-care kind of way. I mean like deep psychic pain, what we could call the kind of Fanonian version of Du Boisian double consciousness, a sense. In fact, one of the passages that's like immediately before the passage that I read you is the scene in Black Skin, White Masks where the speaker, I think of that as poetry more than memoir, but finds his body spread eagled on a white winter's day. So there's like a lot of description of, you know, there are, let's say, like murders and Saint Sebastians all over this archive. And the experience of pain is one that is oftentimes narrated in terms of transcendence. One of the tricky things about working on the material that I was working on in the sections that I read for you today was not just that after 40 readings, I'm still weeping every time I read this memoir, but also pain is a tactic in anti-colonial struggle. And because it's a tactic, it's really ontologically tricky. There's always a nice out if you're a real Fanonian, which I am. There's always a nice out where like like the dialectic Jacob's ladder just kind of keeps going back. So you're like, well, there is no ontic, there is no ontic, there's no ontic, there's no ontic, it's fine, right? It's all strategy. Violence is pure mediation, he says in The Wretched of the Earth. And that gives you a way to do it on the page. But like, you're asking me person to person, I don't know. Like, I don't know that I think that's even fair or right. I mean, I think it's what Fanon meant. I think that Fanon meant putting your body on the line, doing the work of revolution is pain, and pain is mediation, and it's all actually strategic and tactical. But I don't know that that gets at what you're asking, and it's cruel. Actually, it's a cruel way of thinking about what the body is and what it suffers. I think maybe the only other thing I will say is that I'm not a psychoanalytic reader, really, but because my archive is like torture and terror and horror, I can certainly say that there are negotiations of physical experience that include pain, but also include ecstasy, that are here in the archive, that maybe for a better, more careful reader would reveal something consistent or something arguable. So it sounds to me like you're working on a cool project, and I want to hear more about that also, whenever you feel like talking about it. I found Elaine Scarry not helpful. I guess I will also say that.
That makes sense, actually, in light of what you just said. Elaine Scarry wouldn't be helpful for that. Pain is not what I'm personally working on.
Okay.
It was just like something that I had at the back of my mind as well while I was listening to your talk, because it is something so like center of all of these narratives that you are bringing in the talk, but it's just so hard. Like you said, it's very tactical and strategic. So it's difficult to put my finger on what role it's playing in terms of the body politic specifically.
Yeah, I mean, it's also hermeneutic. I think I'll also say this as a post-colonialist, like the extent to which you can, this is what this excerpt of this chapter is about, like the extent to which you can essentially like commodify and reify pain, it is literally your ticket to juridical recognition. And that's not just true in the case of Jamil Abu Pasha. The reason why this text is so important to me is that it's also true in Palestinians' plights to the UN. It's also true in the relationship between the general strike in 1957 in Algeria and what was going to be said at the United Nations meeting about whether to recognize the state or not as an independent state. So pain as a hermeneutic, I think, is also a demand. It's not just a demand of post-colonial states in the geographies that we normally think of them. It's also a demand of the compliant patient. It's also a demand of North American Blackness. It's also a demand of the discourse of Black Lives Matter. Like these ways of thinking about pain, I think, are inherited from the kind of colonial, by which I also mean the triangular trade and enslavement of humans, like colonial somatic interpretive structures. Somebody mentioned Zong in the chat, and I think that's another document that really interrogates the uses of pain in a kind of juridical and public setting.
That makes total sense. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you, Anjuli. I think now all our brains are spinning with essentially everything as you opened out onto such an enormous horizon there. So thank you so much, and let's all thank Anjuli.
Thanks, Ben. It was nice to meet you guys. I hope to be able to visit Brown at some point when we're doing that again, and that'll be fun. And then we'll all go out skipping through the streets.
All right, thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.